At 8:06 a.m., a tow truck was already backing into my driveway while a man dressed in a knockoff police uniform slowly circled my father's 1968 Mustang. He carried a clipboard, wore a polished badge, and possessed exactly zero legal authority to touch anything on my property. This wasn't about an HOA violation. It was a deliberate shakedown orchestrated by Evan Crowley, president of the Ridgeview Palms Homeowners Association. He believed he could intimidate a quiet new resident into surrendering a classic car. He took one look at my casual clothes and decided I was an easy target. That assumption cost him everything. What he didn't know was that the man he was harassing had spent 17 years as a special agent in the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. I wasn't witnessing misconduct. I was documenting a federal crime in real time. This is how I let them walk straight into felony charges, dismantled their entire operation with a single badge reveal, and ensured that cherry red Mustang would be the last vehicle they ever tried to steal. That Mustang wasn't just transportation, it was memory pressed into steel. A 1968 fastback, deep cherry red, with a shallow dent on the rear quarter panel from a grocery store parking lot mishap back in 1991. The bucket seats were original leather, carrying the scent of motor oil, summer highways, and the aftershave my father wore every Sunday morning. He bought the car brand new the year I was born, drove it for 31 years. When he passed, he left it to me with a single instruction written on a folded receipt tucked into the glove compartment. Look after her, she'll look after you. I spent 16 months rebuilding the engine, replacing the carburetor, and reworking the transmission. Now the car rested in my garage at Ridgeview Palms, waiting for its first real drive. I was on leave from the bureau, 10 days of quiet after years of corruption cases, shell companies, and coerced witnesses. All I wanted was to finish the interior and hear the V8 open up on an empty highway. The morning had started peacefully, coffee steaming on the counter, sunlight cutting through the kitchen window, the neighborhood still asleep. Then I noticed the shadow. A black SUV with a roof-mounted light bar crept past my house, slowed, and stopped directly in front of my driveway. Not a real police vehicle. I'd spent too long around actual law enforcement to miss the differences. No department insignia, no unit numbers, just a magnetic door decal reading Community Safety Patrol. The driver stepped out wearing tactical black like he was about to serve a warrant. He walked straight into my open garage, raised his phone, and began photographing the Mustang. I set my coffee down and watched. The crooked badge on his chest read 111, Arizona plate KDL 7294, timestamp 8:06 a.m. The details logged themselves automatically, the same way they had through hundreds of interrogations and crime scenes. Observation first, reaction later. I walked outside calmly, hands loose at my sides, expression neutral. When he heard my footsteps, his right hand dropped to his belt in the reflexive gesture of borrowed authority. I stopped about 9 feet away and asked if I could help him. He introduced himself as Mark Dalton, Community Safety Patrol, and informed me that my vehicle violated HOA Regulations Section 5.1, unregistered vehicles visible from the street and failing community aesthetic standards. I told him the vehicle was registered, insured, and parked inside my private garage on my private property. He replied that the vehicle was old, unsightly, and incompatible with Ridgeview Palms' appearance. He assured me I'd receive a formal violation notice before the end of the day. The speech was smooth, rehearsed, delivered by someone accustomed to compliance. I asked who authorized him to photograph private property. He smiled and said he had full authority from the HOA board. Then he returned to his SUV and drove off, flicking the light bar once at the corner like punctuation. I stood in the driveway, the desert heat pressing against my face. My pulse stayed flat. Anger was useless. I went inside, opened my laptop, and pulled up the HOA's CC&Rs. 49 pages of covenants and restrictions. Section 5.1 prohibited abandoned vehicles, inoperable vehicles, and cars parked on lawns. Nothing about aesthetics, nothing about classic cars, nothing about vehicles inside garages. The Mustang violated nothing. I created a new folder on my desktop, Ridgeview Palms. First entry, Mark Dalton, badge 11, 8:06 a.m. False claim of authority, unauthorized photography, impersonation indicators. I looked back at the Mustang. My father used to say, machines outlast men only if someone cares enough to maintain them. This one would outlast me too. That afternoon, at 4:32 p.m., an envelope slid through the mail slot, crisp white, hand-delivered. The return address read, Ridgeview Palms Homeowners Association, official notice. Inside was a single-page document dressed up to look legal. Violation notice, property address, owner name, alleged violation of Section 5.1 for maintaining a vehicle that failed aesthetic standards. Fine, $450, due within 7 days. Failure to comply would result in vehicle seizure by authorized towing partners. The signature belonged to Evan Crowley, HOA president. I photographed it and added it to the folder. The language was telling, seizure, authorized, big words with no legal backbone. HOAs in Arizona couldn't confiscate private property without a court order. They couldn't fine for violations not listed in their own documents. This wasn't enforcement, it was theater. I walked the neighborhood that evening. 3 houses down, a woman watering her plants stiffened when I mentioned the notice. Her name was Linda Morales. She lived here for 11 years. When I told her the notice involved my car, her watering can froze mid-pour. She glanced around before inviting me onto her porch. 6 months earlier, her sister's car had been towed overnight from Linda's driveway, 2:40 a.m. Impound fee, $780. The HOA claimed it was authorized. No hearing, no appeal. Linda had filmed the tow from her bedroom window. She still had the video. She never reported it. She was afraid. Crowley controlled the board, the patrol, the newsletter. People who resisted found themselves drowning in violations until they moved away. She named at least 10 families affected. The towing company, Desert Apex Towing, was owned by one of Crowley's golf buddies. Every car meant profit, likely kickbacks. The community patrol started as a neighborhood watch. Crowley turned it into a private enforcement arm. Fake uniforms, fake authority, manufactured fear. I thanked her and went home. That night, I drafted a formal response requesting written citation of the violated provision and sent it by certified mail. Then, I ordered 4 security cameras with overnight shipping. Saturday morning, 5 days after the notice and 2 days before the deadline, they came back. A flatbed from Desert Apex idled at my driveway. Mark Dalton stepped out of the SUV. A third man in a cheap suit followed. The playbook was obvious. Dalton provided intimidation. The suit handled persuasion. They announced the compliance period had ended. It hadn't. The lie was deliberate. The man in the suit introduced himself as Robert Ellis, community liaison. He suggested that if I cooperated, penalties could be reduced at the next board meeting. He handed me a document titled Seizure Authorization, stamped Community Enforcement, signed by Evan Crowley. I asked one question: which court issued this order? Silence. I told them calmly they were attempting vehicle theft and criminal impersonation. Dalton warned me Crowley had connections and that troublemakers found their lives getting complicated. I asked if he was threatening me on camera. That's when he noticed the cameras. They left. That evening, I clipped the footage and called Lieutenant Aaron Mitchell at the county sheriff's office. He'd been tracking complaints about Ridgeview Palms for 2 years with no evidence. I told him I had video, documents, and witnesses. He asked if I could come in Monday morning. I agreed. The quiet neighbor with the old car had been building a case since the first mistake they made. Monday morning began before sunrise, the desert air still cool enough to carry sound, and I left the house at 6:18 a.m. with a manila folder under my arm and a flash drive in my pocket, already replaying timelines in my head as naturally as breathing. The sheriff's office sat 20 minutes away, beige concrete and tinted glass, and when I walked inside, I was met by Lieutenant Aaron Mitchell, a compact man in his early 50s with gray threading through his hair and the posture of someone who had learned patience the hard way. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. We went straight into a small conference room with a single window facing the parking lot, and I laid everything out in chronological order. The initial encounter at 8:06 a.m., the violation notice with its fabricated language, the premature tow attempt, the recorded threat, the fraudulent seizure order, and the security footage clipped with timestamps and clear audio. Mitchell studied each item in silence, flipping pages slowly, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow pad, his expression tightening not with surprise but with recognition. When he plugged in the flash drive and watched Dalton threaten me about complicated lives, he replayed that section twice before leaning back in his chair. He said this matched a pattern his department had suspected for years but had never been able to prove because people either paid and moved on or got buried in paperwork until they sold their homes. I told him this wasn't just harassment, it was impersonation, attempted theft, and conspiracy. He agreed, but said proving the HOA president's involvement would require either financial records or insiders willing to talk. I told him I was already working on that. He asked what I did for a living. I deflected, saying I had experience with documentation. He accepted it for now. I left the building at 7:41 a.m. with a clear understanding that local law enforcement was ready but limited, and that the real leverage would come from patterns and money. That afternoon, I began knocking on doors, not as an investigator but as a neighbor asking careful questions, moving slowly through Ridgeview Palms with the timing of someone who understood when to pause and when to listen. The first house belonged to the Hendersons, a couple in their 40s who looked relieved just to have someone acknowledge what had happened to them. Their pickup had been towed 16 months earlier, overnight, while Mrs. Henderson was recovering from knee surgery and couldn't drive. The impound fee had been $920, reduced to $650 after Evan Crawley personally intervened and offered what he called a compassionate adjustment. In exchange, she had signed a form he presented as an acknowledgement of violation. Mr. Henderson retrieved the document from a filing cabinet and handed it to me with shaking hands. It wasn't an acknowledgement, it was a liability waiver, releasing the HOA from all future claims related to vehicle enforcement. That single piece of paper changed the nature of the case. This wasn't opportunistic bullying, it was premeditated damage control. Crawley wasn't just collecting fines, he was collecting legal insulation. I photographed the document and logged it. The next interview was with the Chens, who operated a small catering business out of their home. Their delivery van had been seized for displaying commercial signage, allegedly violating community rules. Mr. Chen had done what most people didn't. He kept receipts. Impound fee paid to Desert Apex Towing, administrative fee paid to the HOA, late penalties, storage charges. Total loss, $1,360. But the critical detail sat at the bottom of one receipt. The administrative fee had been mailed to a post office in Nevada. I asked him if he was sure. He brought out the original envelope. Nevada meant interstate commerce. Interstate commerce meant federal jurisdiction. That one address transformed a neighborhood dispute into a wire fraud case. I logged it and thanked him, watching his shoulders relax slightly, as if speaking the truth had lifted something physical off his chest. By Wednesday noon, I had spoken with 11 families. Losses ranged from $300 fines to $1,800 impounds. 8 had direct encounters with Mark Dalton. 5 had vehicles taken in the middle of the night. One elderly couple had paid weekly penalties for an accessibility ramp required for a disability. Each story differed in detail, but followed the same structure: fabricated violations, urgency, intimidation, payment, silence. Patterns are the language of prosecutions. This one was fluent. I compiled everything into a structured timeline and called Special Agent Rachel Monroe at the Phoenix FBI field office at 7:12 p.m. Rachel and I had crossed paths years earlier on a municipal bribery case, and she understood how thin the line was between a tip and a chargeable offense. I framed the situation as information gathered during personal time, outlined the Nevada connection, and explained the impersonation and extortion elements. She asked precise questions, none wasted, and told me it was enough to justify opening a preliminary inquiry. She asked for a briefing packet by Monday. I agreed. Thursday morning, 2:17 a.m., my motion alerts triggered simultaneously on all 4 cameras. I watched 2 figures approach my driveway, their movements deliberate but tense. Dalton was unmistakable, the slight hitch in his left step giving him away even before the camera caught his face. His partner was younger, nervous, scanning the street like prey expecting a predator. Dalton knelt at my garage door, produced a slim tool, and abandoned it when the security light flared on. He moved to the side window, photographed the Mustang through the glass, then walked to my front door and taped a document to it before retreating to a dark sedan down the block. I waited 5 minutes before retrieving the paper. It was another HOA notice, hastily formatted, riddled with spelling errors, escalating the fine to $950 per day, retroactive, total demanded $5,700, payment due by Friday noon. It threatened liens, collections, and immediate seizure. Panic leaves fingerprints.
I photographed everything and sent the footage to Lieutenant Mitchell before dawn. 6:52 a.m., my phone rang from an unlisted number. Evan Crawley's voice came through smooth but strained, the tone of a man attempting negotiation from a collapsing position. He said he wanted to resolve things amicably. He said fines could be withdrawn if I removed the vehicle within 30 days. I asked if he was aware his patrol officer had trespassed on my property hours ago. Silence. He claimed ignorance, blamed Dalton's initiative. I told him I had video, including delivery of a document bearing his signature. When he spoke again, the warmth was gone. He listed his connections, hinted at audits, permits, professional obstacles. He framed it as advice. I recorded everything. Threatening to weaponize government processes wasn't clever. It was a confession. Friday morning, the tow truck returned. This time, Crawley came with it. Dalton, a liaison. The formation told me everything. They believed this was the end. When Dalton announced seizure authority, I let him finish. When Crawley confirmed personal authorization, I removed my badge and held it where all three could see. The effect was immediate and irreversible. Dalton froze. The liaison walked away and never came back. The tow truck retreated without a word. I calmly named the crimes, listed the evidence, and told Crawley federal charges were imminent. Sheriff's cruisers arrived minutes later. Dalton and Crawley were escorted away in front of the neighbors they'd terrorized for years. By Sunday evening, Ridgeview Palms was standing room only for an emergency HOA meeting. Testimony spilled out, waivers, receipts, stories. A no-confidence vote dissolved the board. Linda Morales was named interim president. 4 months later, Crawley pled guilty to wire fraud and conspiracy. Dalton went to state prison. Desert Apex lost its license. Restitution checks followed. The machine collapsed because it was finally observed, documented, and challenged. All of it started with a single mistake at 8:06 a.m. when they assumed the quiet neighbor with the old car didn't know how to take notes.
The weekend after Evan Crowley and Mark Dalton were escorted out of Ridgeview Palms did not bring calm the way people expected. It brought a low, vibrating tension that sat over the neighborhood like heat trapped under asphalt, because everyone understood something irreversible had started, and no one knew yet how far it would go. Saturday passed with patrol cars making slow, deliberate loops through the streets. Not sirens, not lights, just presence, the kind meant to be seen. I spent the day inside, not hiding, but organizing, cross-referencing timestamps, labeling audio files, annotating statements, building a structure strong enough to survive hostile attorneys and skeptical judges. At 9:11 p.m., Special Agent Rachel Monroe called to confirm the Phoenix field office had opened a preliminary federal inquiry based on the materials I sent. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't speculate. She simply said, "Don't confront anyone. Don't warn anyone. Let them keep talking." I told her I had no intention of interfering. The case had momentum now, and momentum came from pressure, not force. Sunday morning, Crowley was released on bond, and by 10:34 a.m., word spread through the community that he intended to attend the emergency HOA meeting despite his attorney's advice. That decision alone told me everything I needed to know about his mindset. Crowley didn't believe in retreat. He believed in dominance, in the performance of authority, and he thought showing up would reassert control. The meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m. at the clubhouse, and by 5:20, residents were already gathering in clusters, talking in low voices, scanning the parking lot as if expecting something to explode. Inside, folding chairs were dragged from storage to accommodate the crowd, and people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. I took a seat near the center, not hiding, not advertising my presence, just another resident watching events move forward. When Crowley walked in at 5:47, wearing a tailored suit instead of his usual polo, the room reacted instantly. Conversations dropped to whispers, bodies stiffened. He was flanked by a woman carrying a leather briefcase, his attorney, her posture rigid, eyes sharp, already assessing threats. Crowley nodded at a few people as if nothing had changed, as if this were another routine meeting he controlled. It was a mistake. The meeting was called to order by Elaine Porter, a retired teacher who had lived in Ridgeview Palms for over 2 decades and had served on the HOA board long before Crowley's rise. Her voice was steady as she explained the emergency session had been legally invoked and that residents would be allowed to speak. Crowley's attorney objected immediately, citing ongoing investigations. Elaine shut it down without hesitation, stating that governance and accountability were not optional. The first speaker was James Henderson, who walked to the front holding the liability waiver Crowley had tricked his wife into signing. His voice shook as he explained how they'd been pressured, how the so-called mercy discount had been bait for silence. When he finished, he didn't argue, he didn't accuse, he simply held up the document so everyone could see it. A murmur rippled through the room. Then Victor Chen spoke, precise and controlled, laying out numbers like evidence tags, fees, penalties, receipts, the Nevada address that made the room go quiet in a different way. People didn't need legal training to understand that money leaving the state meant something bigger. The testimonies stacked, one after another, each reinforcing the last, forming a shape no speech could undo. An elderly woman spoke about fines for plants that weren't approved. A veteran's daughter described penalties for an accessibility ramp. Each story tightened the room. Crowley remained seated, taking notes, occasionally whispering to his attorney, his composure intact but thinning. When Elaine asked if anyone wished to respond, Crowley stood. He thanked the speakers, acknowledged procedural errors, and proposed a review committee, refunds, reform. It was a familiar move, an attempt to reclaim narrative control. For a moment, it almost worked. Then Mrs. Alvarez, seated near the back, asked a single question about payments to Desert Apex Towing over the past 3 years. Crowley hesitated. His attorney's pen stopped. Others joined in, voices overlapping, questions accelerating. How much money? Who approved it? Where did it go? Crowley raised his hands for order, his voice sharpening as he blamed misinformation, outside influence, manipulation. He pointed directly at me and called me a disruptor who had poisoned the community. I didn't stand. I simply said, clearly and calmly, that I was recording his statement and that threatening witnesses in an open meeting was not advisable. His attorney grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, but the damage was done. Elaine immediately called for a vote of no confidence, citing the bylaws. Hands shot up across the room, not tentatively, but decisively. The count took nearly a full minute. The board was dissolved on the spot. An interim committee was formed, and Linda Morales was named interim president. Crowley walked out without speaking, his attorney trailing behind him, briefcase tight against her chest. The room didn't cheer, it exhaled. Over the next weeks, the criminal process moved with the slow, relentless pace of machinery finally engaged. Federal subpoenas went out, bank records were pulled. Desert Apex's accounts told the story clearly. Consistent transfers tied to specific impounds, routed through shell entities before landing in accounts linked to Crowley. Dalton, facing his own exposure, tried to distance himself, but video footage contradicted every claim. By mid-October, plea negotiations began. Crowley accepted a deal, 24 months in federal custody, restitution totaling $44,800, and a permanent ban from HOA leadership. Dalton received 18 months in state prison for impersonation and attempted theft. Desert Apex lost its operating license. Restitution checks followed, not as charity, but as acknowledgement. I watched the process from a distance, declining interviews, refusing attention, letting the system do what it was designed to do when fed accurate information. One Saturday morning, months later, I finished restoring the Mustang. The engine idled smoothly, the interior complete. I pulled out of the garage and drove through Ridgeview Palms, past porches where people waved without fear. The car didn't bring justice, preparation did. The Mustang was just the excuse they chose to reveal themselves.
The weeks after the emergency meeting unfolded with the quiet inevitability of a structure collapsing from internal stress. Because once the board dissolved and Crowley lost the shield of position, every hidden seam in the operation began to split at once, and Ridgeview Palms transformed from a neighborhood held together by fear into a case study in how quickly power evaporates when scrutiny replaces intimidation. On Tuesday at 8:14 a.m., Lieutenant Aaron Mitchell called to tell me federal subpoenas had been served on Desert Apex Towing, the HOA's former financial administrator, and 2 shell consulting firms that appeared nowhere in the bylaws but everywhere in the money trail. I could hear the satisfaction he was trying not to show. This was the part of the job where patterns became proof. Bank statements showed consistent transfers every time a vehicle was impounded. Administrative fees routed through an out-of-state processor, then redistributed in increments small enough to avoid casual detection but frequent enough to build volume. The amounts were never dramatic individually, 120, 240, 310, but across 31 vehicles over 3 years, the total crossed $44,000, and every transaction was tied to enforcement actions that had no legal foundation. Rachel Monroe confirmed the same findings from the federal side that afternoon, her voice clipped and precise as she explained that wire communications, interstate banking, and coordinated false representations satisfied every element required to proceed. The case was no longer fragile, it was self-supporting. Crowley reacted the only way he knew how, by attempting to regain narrative control. On Thursday, glossy flyers appeared taped to mailboxes, claiming the HOA had been temporarily destabilized by misinformation and promising a return to order and property value protection. The language was defensive, rushed, and legally meaningless, but it revealed panic. The interim board ordered the flyers removed within hours. Linda Morales issued a community notice stating that no enforcement actions were authorized until elections were held and that any threats should be reported directly to the sheriff's office. For the first time in years, residents read an HOA message that didn't sound like a warning. That alone shifted the atmosphere. People lingered outside longer. Cars stayed in driveways without covers. The black SUV with the fake light bar sat abandoned behind the clubhouse, its presence now an embarrassment rather than a threat. Crowley's legal strategy collapsed even faster. His attorney attempted to suppress the recordings of his phone call to me, arguing expectation of privacy, but the motion failed when the timestamps, context, and explicit threats were reviewed. Dalton tried to claim he believed his authority was legitimate, but video of him announcing seizure deadlines that hadn't expired destroyed that defense completely. When confronted with footage of the 2:17 a.m. trespass, he stopped talking entirely. Gerald Whitaker, the former liaison, changed sides with remarkable speed. Offered limited immunity in exchange for cooperation, he provided a detailed account of how Crowley structured the operation, who approved what, how payments were justified internally, and how fear was used deliberately as leverage. He described Crowley's obsession with appearances, how enforcement wasn't about rules but obedience. Gerald moved out of state within a week, leaving behind an empty rental and unpaid utilities, a man exiting the stage as quietly as possible. By late September, plea negotiations were no longer theoretical. Crowley's attorneys requested a global resolution, hoping to avoid trial exposure that would include testimony from disabled residents, families with medical emergencies, and video evidence that left no room for reinterpretation. The agreement was finalized in federal court without ceremony. Crowley pled guilty to wire fraud and conspiracy to deprive rights under color of authority. The judge noted that the HOA structure had been used not as governance, but as revenue mechanism enforced through intimidation. Sentence: 24 months in federal custody, followed by supervised release. Restitution totaling $44,800, and a lifetime prohibition from serving on any HOA board within the state. Crowley stood expressionless as the terms were read, his tailored suit hanging looser than it had months earlier, the performance stripped away completely. Dalton's outcome was faster and harsher than he expected. His attempt to withdraw his plea failed when prosecutors played footage of him threatening residents while flashing his counterfeit badge. The judge didn't raise his voice when he sentenced Dalton to 18 months in state prison for criminal impersonation and attempted theft. He simply stated that pretending to be law enforcement eroded public trust and would be punished accordingly. Dalton nodded once, not in agreement but resignation. Desert Apex Towing lost its operating license permanently. The owner paid $48,000 in fines and was barred from the industry for a decade. The company's trucks disappeared from the neighborhood as if they had never existed. Restitution followed with administrative efficiency that felt almost surreal after years of chaos. Checks were mailed to affected families on a staggered schedule. The Hendersons received theirs on a Monday afternoon. Mrs. Henderson cried when she opened the envelope, not from relief, but from validation. The Chens framed their refund notice and hung it in their kitchen as proof that meticulous records mattered. The elderly veteran received a formal apology from the interim board, along with a permanent exemption for accessibility modifications. His daughter told me later that he read the letter twice before setting it next to his service medals. For him, the acknowledgement meant more than the money. Elections were held 60 days after the emergency meeting. Turnout broke every prior record. Linda Morales was elected president with 71% of the vote. The new board dissolved the community patrol program entirely, sold the black SUV at auction, and redirected the proceeds to a neighborhood legal aid fund. The bylaws were rewritten to eliminate vague enforcement language and require independent review before any penalties could be assessed.
Transparency replaced theater. Silence replaced fear. I stayed deliberately in the background as the neighborhood rebuilt itself. I declined invitations to speak at meetings, refused interviews, and avoided being positioned as a symbol. This had never been about heroics. It was about process, about documenting facts and letting institutions function once they were forced to see clearly. By October, the Mustang restoration was complete. The leather seats were conditioned, the dash polished, the engine tuned until it idled clean and steady. On a quiet Saturday morning, I eased it out of the garage and drove through Ridgeview Palms without stopping. Neighbors waved. No one looked away. The street felt lighter, less compressed. When I reached the main road, I accelerated, the V8 opening up the way it was meant to, sound rolling back across the desert. The car hadn't changed. The environment around it had, and that difference was permanent.
What surprised most people afterward was not how quickly the operation collapsed, but how silent it became once the machinery stopped moving, because fear had been the only sound holding Ridgeview Palms together for years, and when that sound vanished, what remained was an unfamiliar quiet that forced everyone to confront how much space intimidation had been occupying. In the days following Crawley's plea agreement, the neighborhood moved cautiously, like a place relearning its own shape. Cars stayed parked openly, garage doors remained half-raised. People spoke longer on sidewalks without scanning for uniforms that no longer existed. I noticed the change most clearly at night, when the streets no longer felt watched, when the absence of that black SUV made darkness feel neutral instead of hostile. On Wednesday at 7:09 p.m., Linda Morales called to tell me the interim board had completed its first full audit of HOA finances, and the numbers confirmed what the investigation had already revealed. Funds diverted under vague administrative categories, enforcement costs inflated beyond reason, and entire budget lines that existed solely to mask transfers. She asked if I wanted to review the report before it was distributed to residents. I declined. My role had ended when the evidence became undeniable. Oversight belonged to the people who lived there. Crawley's absence created a vacuum, but it wasn't filled by another strongman. It was filled by process. The interim board instituted open meetings, recorded minutes, and published every expense online. Complaints were logged publicly, not filtered through private email accounts. Enforcement actions required written justification tied directly to specific bylaw sections. The difference wasn't dramatic, it was structural, and structure is what prevents abuse from returning under a different name. I watched the transformation from a distance, noticing how quickly behavior adapted when fear was removed from the equation. People stopped whispering, they started asking questions. The neighborhood didn't become perfect, it became accountable. Dalton's sentencing came quietly on a Thursday morning, without press or spectacle. I wasn't in the courtroom, I read the transcript later. The judge spoke briefly about authority and the damage caused when it's imitated without accountability. Dalton offered no statement. His counterfeit badge was entered into evidence one final time, photographed and destroyed. The image stayed with me more than the sentence itself, a symbol manufactured to intimidate, reduced to documentation, then erased. That was how the entire operation ended, not with drama, but with records. Desert Apex Towing vanished almost overnight. Their lot, once full of vehicles, sat empty behind a chain-link fence with a foreclosure notice stapled crookedly to the office door. The phone number listed on their receipts is connected. The owner paid his fines and retreated into obscurity. A man who had confused proximity to power with immunity. The Nevada post office box was closed. Shell entities dissolved, each piece removed cleanly, leaving no mechanism for the scheme to reassemble itself elsewhere under the same configuration. Restitution continued to arrive in waves. By mid-November, all 31 families had been reimbursed. Some deposited the checks without comment. Others treated them like artifacts, proof that what had happened to them was real and recognized. One man stopped me on the sidewalk to say he hadn't realized how tense he had been living until the tension was gone. He didn't thank me. He didn't need to. The neighborhood thanked itself by refusing to return to silence. The first contested HOA election in over a decade was held on a clear Sunday afternoon. Folding tables were set up in the clubhouse, ballots counted by volunteers, results announced before sunset. Linda Morales won decisively, but what mattered more than the margin was the turnout. Participation itself had become a statement. The new board's first resolution eliminated discretionary enforcement entirely. If a rule couldn't be cited clearly and applied uniformly, it couldn't be enforced at all. The community patrol program was formally dissolved.
its remaining equipment auctioned off. The black SUVs sold for $3,200, proceeds earmarked for a legal education fund to help residents understand their rights under state law. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I returned to my own routines quietly: morning coffee, evening walks, occasional waves exchanged with neighbors who now felt comfortable acknowledging one another. The Mustang sat in the garage, fully restored, no longer a point of contention, but a constant reminder of how arbitrary the conflict had been. The car hadn't changed. The meaning attached to it had. It was no longer a target. It was simply mine. On a Saturday in late October, I finally took it out for a long drive. Not a victory lap, just motion. The engine responded smoothly, the sound steady and familiar, carrying me past the edge of the neighborhood and into open desert. The road stretched wide and empty, heat rising in faint ripples off the asphalt. I thought about my father's handwriting on that folded receipt, the simplicity of the instruction he'd left me. He hadn't meant the car itself. He'd meant responsibility, care, attention. The same principles that unraveled Crawley's operation applied everywhere else, too. Systems fail when people stop watching them. They collapse when someone finally does. I didn't call anyone during that drive. I let the miles pass without commentary, without narration, without turning it into something symbolic. When I returned home, the sun was low, the garage door open, the neighborhood quiet in a way that felt earned rather than imposed. Maria Santos waved from across the street. The Hendersons were working in their yard, their truck parked openly in the driveway. The veteran sat on his porch, ramp unobstructed, watching the afternoons settle. That night, I archived the Ridgeview Palms folder on my laptop, not deleted, archived. Evidence belongs to history once it's no longer needed for justice. I labeled it clearly and stored it alongside closed cases from years past. Another pattern identified, another system corrected, nothing more required. The following Monday, Rachel Monroe called to ask if I was ready to return to work. I told her I'd be back by the end of the week. She asked if the situation at home had resolved itself. I said yes. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. The Bureau runs on documentation, not anecdotes. Ridgeview Palms didn't become famous. It didn't attract attention beyond court filings and archived news briefs. It simply resumed being a place where people lived without being managed through fear. That was enough. Power had entered quietly and left the same way, exposed not by confrontation but with consistency, the kind that records timestamps, saves receipts, and waits until the pattern reveals itself.
By the time November settled into the desert, the case had moved out of the neighborhood and into a different kind of quiet. The procedural quiet that follows indictments and signed agreements, where nothing dramatic happens on the surface, but everything underneath is locked into place. Ridgeview Palms adjusted faster than I expected. Without enforcement notices taped to doors, people began rediscovering routines that had been suppressed for years. Kids rode bikes after dinner, garage doors stayed open longer, conversations stretched past polite limits and into genuine exchanges. Fear had been the organizing principle before, and its absence required recalibration. I noticed it most in the way people parked their cars, no longer angled defensively, no longer hidden, no longer treated as liabilities waiting to be exploited. On Monday at 8:32 a.m., Linda Morales forwarded the finalized audit to all residents, a 60-page document that itemized every questionable transaction and every corrective measure taken. It wasn't written for prosecutors, it was written for clarity. Names, dates, amounts, and explanations laid out without commentary. Transparency as a habit, not a performance. The federal case progressed on a parallel track, invisible to most of the community, but deliberate in its movement. On Wednesday, Rachel Monroe emailed to confirm that Crowley's plea had been formally accepted and that sentencing was scheduled for early December. She didn't include opinions, she included deadlines. Restitution calculations finalized, asset forfeiture filed, victim impact statements requested but not required. The system was doing what it did best when fed complete information, reducing chaos into process. I declined to submit a personal statement. The facts spoke loudly enough without me adding narrative weight. My involvement was already documented where it mattered. Dalton's situation unraveled more publicly, though not noisily. He attempted to withdraw his guilty plea days before sentencing, claiming coercion and misunderstanding. The motion was denied within hours. The judge cited recorded footage showing Dalton announcing fabricated deadlines and threatening residents with consequences he had no authority to impose. The ruling was concise. There was no ambiguity to argue against. When Dalton was sentenced, the transcript recorded him standing motionless, eyes fixed forward, the posture of someone who had finally reached the end of borrowed authority. His counterfeit badge was entered into evidence one last time before being destroyed. The physical symbol mattered less than the record of its use. Documentation outlived intimidation. The restitution process created its own rhythm. Checks arrived in envelopes stamped with court seals, not HOA letterheads. Families reacted differently. Some deposited the money immediately, eager to close the chapter. Others held the envelopes for days, reluctant to let go of proof that what had happened was real and acknowledged. One afternoon, I found an envelope taped to my door with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note from an elderly couple thanking me for standing still when everyone else moved away. There was no money, no expectation of response. I archived the note with the rest of the materials, not as evidence, but as context. Systems fail quietly. They heal quietly, too. Desert Apex Towing's collapse rippled outward in subtle ways. Their trucks disappeared from streets across the county, and other towing companies adjusted their contracts quickly, adding compliance language and legal reviews they had previously ignored. Fear-based enforcement had been profitable, but it had also been lazy. Once challenged, it proved unsustainable. The Nevada post office box was closed, the shell entities dissolved, paper trails ended where accountability began. I tracked these developments the way I always had, not out of obsession, but out of habit. Closure is a function of verification. The first snowfall in the mountains came early that year, dusting peaks visible from the main road outside Ridgeview Palms. I noticed it during a morning drive, the Mustang's engine humming steadily, the heater working just enough to take the edge off the air. Driving had become ordinary again. No watchers, no calculations, just motion. The car felt lighter without the weight of attention attached to it. That, more than the legal outcomes, felt like resolution. On Friday evening, the interim board held its final meeting before the official transition. Attendance was lower than the emergency session, but still higher than any meeting from the previous decade. Linda Morales summarized the reforms implemented, the elections held, the patrol dissolved, the funds reallocated. She didn't frame them as victories, she framed them as corrections. When she opened the floor for questions, none came, not because people were disengaged, but because they were satisfied. Satisfaction is rare in governance. It usually signals that procedures are working quietly enough not to demand attention. I remained deliberately peripheral. I didn't accept invitations to serve on committees. I didn't advise policy. My presence had already altered the dynamic enough. Influence has diminishing returns when it lingers too long. On Saturday morning, I archived the last active files from the Ridgeview Palms folder and backed them up to an external drive labeled with the case reference number provided by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Evidence belongs where it can be retrieved, not where it can be revisited endlessly. That distinction matters. Sentencing day arrived without spectacle. Crowley stood before the judge in a courtroom that felt smaller than it should have, his tailored suit replaced by something generic, his posture stripped of confidence. The sentence was read plainly: 24 months in federal custody, supervised release, restitution, lifetime prohibition from HOA leadership within the state. The judge spoke briefly about abuse of trust and the damage caused when governance becomes a weapon. Crowley did not speak. When he was escorted away, there was no reaction from the gallery. Justice doesn't require applause to function. The neighborhood learned about the sentencing through a single paragraph in the local paper and an email from the new board acknowledging the outcome without commentary. That restraint mattered. It kept the story from becoming a myth. It kept it grounded in facts. Ridgeview Palms didn't need legends. It needed records. I spent the following weeks easing back into work mode, reviewing assignments, closing out leave, resetting routines. The transition was seamless because I had never fully disengaged. On Monday at 9 a.m., I walked into the office, badge clipped, mindset calibrated. Rachel Monroe nodded from across the room and handed me a file without ceremony. Work resumed the way it always did, one documented pattern at a time. Occasionally, on quiet evenings, I drove the Mustang through the neighborhood, not to be seen, but because movement felt good again. Maria Santos waved from her porch. The Hendersons' driveway stayed full. The veterans' ramp remained unobstructed. These weren't symbols, they were conditions restored. That distinction mattered. The case didn't end with celebration, it ended with normalcy. That was the point all along. Fear thrives on attention, accountability thrives on records. When the balance shifts, power loses its camouflage. Ridgeview Palms didn't change because someone fought harder. It changed because someone watched longer, documented better, and waited until the pattern could no longer deny itself.
Winter moved through the desert gently that year, not with snow or storms, but with shorter light and cooler air that carried sound farther. And Ridgeview Palms settled into a version of itself that most residents had never actually known, because normal had been postponed for so long it felt new.
By early January, the HOA office reopened under interim management, not as a command center, but as a place where paperwork lived and nothing else. No patrol schedules, no enforcement calendars, just records. I noticed the change in small, measurable ways. Mailboxes stopped filling with warning letters. Front lawns reflected personal taste instead of compliance anxiety. People argued again about ordinary things, parking courtesy, noise, trash pickup, because those arguments meant fear was no longer the background noise. On January 12th at 7:44 a.m., Linda Morales emailed the community to announce the completion of the bylaw rewrite, ratified by resident vote. The language was precise and unambiguous, the kind that left little room for interpretation or exploitation. Vague authority had been replaced with defined limits, and that shift mattered more than any individual sentence. The federal case entered its quietest phase then, the part where everything important had already happened and nothing could be undone. Crowley was transferred to a low-security federal facility outside the state, a logistical detail I learned only because restitution disbursements required updated inmate information. Dalton was processed into state custody shortly after, his name disappearing from public records except where it had already been preserved in court filings. Gerald Whitaker's cooperation became a sealed appendix to the prosecution, referenced but unseen, his role reduced to footnotes and numbered paragraphs. The machine had finished its work and shut itself down. I archived the final correspondence and closed the folder for the last time, not ceremonially, but deliberately, because endings should be clear enough not to invite reopening. One afternoon, while walking back from the mailbox, I ran into Mrs. Alvarez, who had asked the question that broke Crowley's composure at the emergency meeting. She looked lighter, not relieved exactly, but steadier. She told me she'd lived there for 17 years and had always assumed the stress she carried was normal, that neighborhoods simply worked that way. Now she slept better. That was all she said. She didn't thank me. She didn't need to. Her statement was a metric, not a compliment. Reduced stress is measurable. It's one of the few outcomes that doesn't lie. The Mustang remained parked in my garage most days, not because I feared attention returning, but because the urgency attached to it had finally dissolved. I no longer needed to prove it belonged there. Ownership was uncontested now, both legally and socially. When I did take it out, the drives were unremarkable in the best way. No watchers, no pauses, no calculations about who might be documenting what. Just an engine responding to pressure and a road unfolding without subtext. That absence of subtext was the real victory, even if no one ever labeled it as such. In mid-February, the new HOA board published its first annual budget proposal, and I read it out of habit rather than necessity. The numbers were conservative, transparent, and frankly boring. That too mattered. Abusive systems rely on complexity to hide misconduct. Boring budgets are hard to weaponize. The proposal passed without controversy. No emergency sessions, no accusations, no whispered conversations in hallways afterward. People went home when the meeting ended. That alone would have been unthinkable months earlier. At work, the Ridgeview Palms case became a reference point, cited occasionally in internal discussions about how small-scale corruption often survives not because it's sophisticated, but because it's ignored. I never presented it as a story. I presented it as a sequence of documented decisions and predictable outcomes. Patterns don't require embellishment. They speak through repetition. When younger agents asked how long it had taken to break the operation, I told them the truth, that it took years for it to grow and only weeks for it to collapse once someone stopped accepting the first explanation offered. That answer disappointed them. They wanted speed. I gave them patience instead. By March, restitution was complete. The court-appointed administrator issued a final accounting confirming all approved claims had been paid in full. No surplus, no deficit, clean closure. Linda Morales forwarded the notice to residents with a single line. This matter is now resolved. No commentary followed. People didn't need reminders of what they'd already lived through. They needed assurance it wouldn't return. Closure is as much about restraint as it is about action. One evening near the end of the month, I sat in the garage with the Mustang's hood open, not fixing anything, just checking connections the way my father used to, hands moving automatically over components he'd taught me to respect. Machines respond to attention. Systems do too. He'd understood that instinctively, even if he'd never framed it that way. I realized then that the reason the car had mattered so much to Crowley wasn't aesthetics or value, it was visibility. It was something he couldn't quietly control. That was always the trigger. Power hates unregulated presence. The neighborhood no longer felt like a case study. It felt like a place.
Kids' chalk drawings appeared on sidewalks without being scrubbed away. A garage band practiced on weekends without triggering complaint chains. The absence of enforcement noise created room for ordinary friction, the kind communities are supposed to manage collectively rather than through threats. That balance was fragile but functional, and everyone seems to be aware of it in the same unspoken way people become aware of their footing after slipping once. In early April, I received a forwarded email from Linda Morales announcing the sale of the last remaining patrol equipment. The proceeds were modest, but the symbolism wasn't. The funds were earmarked for a resident education initiative on property law and HOA governance. Knowledge, distributed openly, is the most effective deterrent to abuse. Crowley relied on ignorance. The new board institutionalized clarity. That inversion ensured the pattern wouldn't repeat under a different name. I saw Crowley's name one last time in a sentencing summary forwarded internally at work, a sterile paragraph listing conviction, term, and restrictions. No drama, no commentary, just outcome. The system doesn't personalize justice, it records it. That was enough. On a quiet afternoon, driving back from the highway, I slowed as I entered Ridgeview Palms, not out of caution, but habit. Maria Santos waved from her porch. The Hendersons' truck sat openly in their driveway, no cover, no note on the windshield. Mrs. Alvarez sat on her steps, watching the street without tension in her posture. These weren't gestures of gratitude, they were indicators, conditions normalized, threat removed, system corrected. The story didn't end with applause or recognition. It ended with predictability returning to a place that had forgotten what that felt like. Power lost its camouflage because someone treated it as data instead of drama, and once that happened, everything else followed the way it always does, when the truth is documented carefully enough to stand on its own.
Spring arrived without announcement, the way it does in the desert, not with blossoms or rain, but with longer evenings and a quality of light that made everything look newly rinsed. And Ridgeview Palms settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than enforced, a rhythm no one questioned anymore because there was nothing left to push against. By late April, the clubhouse doors were usually open during the day, not because meetings were happening, but because people felt free to use the space again, to sit, to talk, to exist without assuming every interaction would be documented or monetized. The bulletin board that once carried laminated warning notices now held handwritten flyers for garage sales, tutoring offers, and a lost dog that was returned within an hour because neighbors actually spoke to each other. The transformation wasn't dramatic, it was cumulative, the kind of change that only becomes obvious when you realize you've stopped bracing for impact. I noticed it most in myself, in the way I no longer tracked movement automatically when I stepped outside, in the way my eyes no longer searched for insignia that shouldn't exist. Vigilance is hard to turn off once it's been trained, but even that begins to fade when there's nothing left to justify it. At work, the Ridgeview Palms case closed formally with a final internal memo circulated for record-keeping purposes, a dry document listing charges, outcomes, restitution figures, and compliance notes, everything reduced to text that could be retrieved later if needed. No one celebrated it, no one needed to. The Bureau doesn't operate on satisfaction, it operates on resolution. When a system stops generating harm, attention moves elsewhere. That's how it's supposed to work. I filed the memo, archived the case reference, and moved on to the next assignment without carrying anything forward except the pattern recognition that always stays with you whether you want it to or not. On a Saturday morning in May, I rolled the Mustang out of the garage early, the air still cool enough to justify the light jacket I'd thrown on out of habit. The car had been running flawlessly for weeks, but that morning felt different, not because of the machine, but because the road ahead was no longer framed by anything unresolved. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, past houses that had once felt like observation points and now felt like homes. Maria Santos was trimming hedges, her movements relaxed. She looked up, waved, and went back to work without stopping. The Hendersons' driveway held 2 vehicles, neither covered, neither positioned defensively. The veteran sat on his porch ramp, coffee in hand, nodding once as I passed. No one stared, no one followed. That absence of attention was the clearest signal that everything had ended where it was supposed to. I turned onto the main road and accelerated, the Mustang responding the way it always had, engine note deepening as the desert opened on both sides. The highway stretched ahead, pale and empty, mountains hazy in the distance. I drove without destination for a while, letting the car settle into its own rhythm, thinking not about the case, not about Crowley or Dalton or any of the names that had once filled my notes, but about how easily systems slide into abuse when no one checks them, and how fragile that abuse becomes the moment someone does. It wasn't a revelation, it was confirmation.
the kind you only get when you watch something run its full course. When I returned home later that afternoon, the garage door lifted smoothly, sunlight spilling across the concrete floor, and I parked the Mustang where it had always belonged. Not as a symbol, not as evidence, just as a car that had outlasted a moment of manufactured authority. I shut the engine off and sat there for a second longer than necessary, listening to the ticking of cooling metal, a familiar sound that had nothing to do with conflict or resolution. My father had understood that sound. He'd understood that care wasn't dramatic, it was repetitive. It was attention applied consistently over time. That principle had carried further than he'd probably imagined. That evening, the new HOA board sent out a brief update announcing the completion of all transitional measures and the formal return to standard governance under the revised bylaws. The email was concise, factual, and unremarkable. I read it once and deleted it. There was nothing left to track, no loose ends worth monitoring. The system had corrected itself because it had been forced to see itself clearly, and once that happened, it didn't require continued supervision from me. Oversight works best when it becomes invisible again. Weeks passed, then months. Ridgeview Palms faded from my active awareness the way resolved cases always do, slipping into background memory where details blur and only structure remains. Occasionally, someone new would move in, unaware of what had come before, and that ignorance was the final indicator of success. Communities shouldn't be defined by their worst moments. They should be allowed to forget them once safeguards are in place. Forgetting, in that sense, isn't denial, it's recovery. One evening, near the start of summer, I found myself sitting on the back porch watching the sky shift colors as the sun dropped behind the mountains. The air still warm, cicadas starting their slow build toward night. The neighborhood was quiet but not empty. Doors opened and closed. Laughter drifted briefly from somewhere down the street. A car passed without slowing. All ordinary signals, all things that had once felt uncertain, now happening without comment. I didn't document any of it. I didn't need to. Some conditions are stable enough to be trusted once they've been earned. The Mustang remained part of my routine, not as a reminder of what had happened, but as a continuation of something that started long before Ridgeview Palms existed, long before Crowley decided authority was something he could borrow and weaponize. Machines outlast people when someone cares enough to maintain them. Communities do too. That lesson didn't require a closing statement or a moral attached to it. It existed on its own, visible in the absence of fear, audible in the sound of an engine running cleanly, present in the way people stopped looking over their shoulders when they stepped outside. Nothing about the ending was cinematic. There were no final confrontations, no lingering threats, no last-minute reversals. The story concluded the way most real ones do, not with noise, but with normalization. Power retreated because it had been exposed, and once exposed, it couldn't survive without disguise. All that remained was a neighborhood functioning as intended and a car resting in a garage where it belonged, both quietly doing what they were built to do. The quiet neighbor was no longer a variable. He was just a neighbor again, and that was the point.